community and beyond. So a very strong sense of social harmony is a defining characteristic of being human. And if you do not commit yourself to social harmony, then it's difficult for you to be able to sustain as a human being. And if you consider your nature is good, all human beings have good nature, you assume that social harmony is achievable without certain kind of coercive force from the outside. This is basically mentioned, as I pointed out. Now, Xunzi would say, you really have to learn something you don't have. Social solidarity is so difficult to achieve. Social solidarity as an achievement requires communal effort. You have to assume that there are something human beings don't have. In other words, you cannot assume that social harmony will emerge naturally. And of course, I pointed out how difficult to manage a family, because differentiation, both Mencius and Xunzi assume not just cultural differentiation, but social differentiation is central for the harmony of society. I want to be a bit philosophical, but it's not difficult to follow. Both Mencius and Xunzi believe that there's a gap between what I am and what I ought to be. This gap needs to be bridged. You can say, I am not what I ought to be. And this sense of trying to be what I ought to be, in most other cases, is to say you have to transcend yourself as a human being. You have to transcend all the so-called constraints that shape you as a human being. I pointed out before, your ethnicity, your gender, your cultural tradition, your linguistic universe, your age cohort. You really have to transcend all these constraints for you to be fully human. The Confucian traditions, not only you shouldn't, these constraints are necessary for you to develop yourself. So the proposition is I'm not what I ought to be, but what I ought to be is rooted in what I am, even here now. And so an assumption is you approach this topic as a personal problem. If you don't consider it as a personal problem, you consider it as a general human problem, not linked to your daily experience, then you depart from the Confucian way. That's true with Christianity, with Buddhism, with Hinduism, with many other traditions. But the Confucians believe all these constraints, so-called constraints, are important. So some scholars, it's only developed in modern times, believe, especially people in evolutionary theory, that these constraints are enabling constraints, empowering constraints. These constraints make you or shape you to become what you ought to be. So from the Mencian point of view, these constraints can be overcome. You try to cultivate the sprouts or the beginnings of your way of being human. Xunzi argues that you really have to deny them. Not deny them, you have to transform it. Transform all of them by acquiring values from the outside. And it is in this sense, Xunzi can be considered as advocating virtue ethics. Each of the virtues, to be courageous, to be kind, to be responsive, to be responsible. Each one of them will have to be acquired, will have to be learned. And this learning civilization is absolutely critical. And because Xunzi's idea that if you do not do that, social solidarity is difficult to maintain, and when social solidarity is difficult to maintain, that society will not be ordered, and if society is not ordered, human beings will not be able to survive, not to mention flourish. So this is the Xunzian position. Of course, immediately you begin to ask the question, where is the basis for the human beings, not only to perfect themselves, but to acquire these values. Is there a basis in human? That human capacity is able to do that. Xunzi makes it very explicit. This one capacity of the human, that is the reason for this cultivation. It's knowledge. We say cognition. It's ability to know. The ability to know is the essential characteristic of being human. That's true with many of the great ethical systems in the West, including Kantianism. Your nature is not reliable, but your ability to know, knowing your nature is not reliable, that's a very great motivation for you to learn, for you to acquire values from the outside. Therefore, you need to have friends. You need to have teachers. You need to have some kind of cultural resources that have already been developed. These have been developed by the sages. Now, earlier I mentioned that there's certain kind of egalitarianism in the Confucian tradition, that each and every human being is endowed with this ability to know. And each and every human being is also, in terms of nature, there's possible of excessive discussions or development of one's potential. And it is important to acquire those values from outside, and the sages and the people like us are totally equal. The sages and us are the same. The sages know and try to work it out in a more positive way, in a more forthright, straightforward way. And some of us are not good enough in taking into consideration of our cognitive ability to know the world. That's the reason why everybody, including sages, will have to be involved in learning, in cultivation. And therefore, there's a term which is very unusual. Xunzi uses it almost idiosyncratically. That is the term of artificiality. Anything that's artificial, meaning humanly constructed, is a value. So culture is a value, education is a value, the ritual propriety